Welcome to the channel. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Look, today we're tackling a massive, highly complex, and honestly deeply influential concept, Greater Israel. Our goal for this explainer is to really unpack the historical, theological, and geopolitical layers of this ideology. And, crucially, we're going to connect those deep foundations to the massive 2026 West Bank policies that are literally shifting the reality on the ground as we speak. We're strictly looking at documented sources, historical records, and policy analysis to map out exactly what's going on and why it absolutely matters. Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly does an ancient scriptural promise transform over decades into a concrete bureaucratic reality? It's a totally fascinating journey, going from theology to cartography and ultimately straight into modern geopolitics. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll define Greater Israel. Second, we'll trace the journey from scripture to statecraft. Third, we're looking closely at the 2026 West Bank policies. Fourth, we'll cover international law and the global backlash. And finally, number 5, the broader regional geopolitical impacts. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. Defining Greater Israel and understanding the concept of Eretz Yisrael HaShlema.
So the Hebrew phrase you'll commonly hear is Eretz Yisrael HaShlema, which translates more accurately to the whole land of Israel. And that word, shalem, is incredibly important here. It means complete or whole. For proponents of this ideology, the land has this fundamental, unified nature to it, meaning any kind of political partition isn't just seen as some strategic compromise, it genuinely feels like a violation of the land's essential, divinely ordained character. But what actually makes up those borders? Well, that varies wildly depending on who you're talking to. We generally see two main interpretations here. First, there's the narrow political view, which basically refers to the territory of Mandatory Palestine. So essentially everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Then, on the flip side, you have the maximalist, biblical view. This one draws on interpretations from the book of Genesis and envisions a massive chunk of territory, expanding all the way from the Nile River over in Egypt, right up to the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. Moving on to Section 2, from scripture to statecraft, the historical evolution of an ideology. If we look back and trace the progression of this idea, you see a really distinct evolution. Back in 1897, early Zionist founder Theodor Herzl was brainstorming potential borders, kind of looking at biblical boundaries as negotiable instruments for a Jewish refuge. Then hit the 1920s, and Vladimir Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionism takes a much more rigid stance, officially claiming both banks of the Jordan River, which actually includes what is now the Kingdom of Jordan. But the real game changer? That was the 1967 Six-Day War. Capturing new territories like the West Bank and Gaza totally energized religious nationalists, who saw the victory as literal biblical prophecy fulfilled. And now, fast forward 2026, we're seeing this evolve into official civilian administrative control of those very territories.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the current leadership openly embraces this territorial vision. In late 2025, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly framed territorial maximalism not just as a day-to-day security issue, but as this grand, historic, spiritual, and generational mandate to guarantee the state's destiny. And guys, this represents a massive, massive shift. For decades, right after the state was established in 1948, the idea of a Greater Israel was mostly kept to the political fringes. It was seen as an ultra-nationalist dream. But today, the sources show it has shifted right into mainstream government doctrine. What we're looking at is an accelerated codification of territorial practice, pushed forward by coalition members who are explicitly committed to West Bank annexation. All right, Section 3, the 2026 West Bank policies, administrative annexation in practice. So the absolutely crucial point here is the sheer scale of the February 2026 cabinet decisions. We're not just talking about building a few new settlements. It is a fundamental restructuring of how the area is governed. The military is actively handing over administrative powers to civilian ministries. They're registering land in Area C, that's the part of the West Bank under full Israeli control, as Israeli state land. They're lifting old restrictions on land sales and revoking Palestinian municipal powers in key spots like Hebron. They're even extending Israeli enforcement into areas A and B, which, if you remember the Oslo Accords, were originally designated for Palestinian Authority control. Just to give you a sense of the scale of this bureaucratic shift, $244 million. That's the initial budget in new Israeli shekels that the government allocated purely for land registration activities in Area C between 2026 and 2030. So yeah, this is a highly funded, state-backed administrative push.
Let's map out exactly how this builds a systematic mechanism for annexation. Step 1. Dismantle the temporary military occupation structure. Step 2. Replace it with direct, permanent Israeli civilian authority through standard government ministries. And Step 3. Use this brand new legal framework to formalize land acquisitions and massively accelerate settlement expansion, which, by design, weakens the Palestinian Authority in the process.
And that brings us to Section 4, International Law and Condemnation, the global backlash. The International Court of Justice delivered a landmark advisory opinion in 2024. They stated, and I quote, Israel's presence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem no longer qualifies as a temporary occupation, but rather constitutes an unlawful presence due to its permanent and systematic character. You see, international courts draw a really hard line between a temporary military occupation and an effort to permanently change the legal and demographic makeup of a territory, which they essentially view as de facto annexation. Specifically, international bodies are pointing to several key violations here. These 2026 policies are accused of breaching Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which strictly prohibits an occupying power from transferring its civilian population into occupied territory. They also directly contravene UN Security Council Resolution 2334 regarding the illegality of settlements. And broadly speaking, they're widely condemned for denying the Palestinian right to self-determination by systematically eroding any physical or legal possibility of a two-state solution.
And the condemnation from global human rights organizations has been pretty severe. Amnesty International, for example, put out a statement asserting that this is an unprecedented escalation in both scale and speed. They said, what we are witnessing is a state openly gloating about its defiance of international law. They argue that these formalized land grabs are designed to entrench an unlawful occupation, with complete confidence that they won't face any real pushback from the international community.
Let's zoom out for Section 5, Regional Geopolitical Impacts Beyond the West Bank.
And this brilliantly illustrates the strategic thinking that has historically accompanied the Greater Israel vision. What you're looking at here is the controversial 1982 Odette Innan Plan. It basically theorized that long-term Israeli security could be guaranteed by fragmenting neighboring Arab states like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt along sectarian and ethnic fault lines. The intended outcome? To dissolve unified military threats, making sure no single neighboring power could ever challenge Israeli dominance. Which actually connects to a modern geopolitical theory, often called the Hexagon of Alliances. The whole concept here is that Greater Israel seeks to position itself as the unchallenged, dominant hub in a region that is purposefully weakened by internal fractures. The idea is that by capitalizing on regional instability, the state secures uncontested energy corridors and much-needed strategic depth.
But listen, this isn't just theoretical history. The rhetoric from current Israeli officials actively reflects this expansionist mindset today. Just look at 2024, when Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich publicly called for Israel to, quote, expand to Damascus. Now, whether you view that as political posturing or serious strategic intent, this kind of rhetoric actively alarms neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And for sure, it severely complicates any broader Middle Eastern diplomatic relations and normalization efforts.
Which leaves us with a truly profound question to end on. If the spatial, legal, and administrative architecture of annexation in the West Bank actually becomes irreversible, what remains of the two-state solution? I mean, are we witnessing the permanent erasure of international consensus in favor of a totally new, unilaterally imposed reality? It's a heavy question, but it's exactly what the entire international community is grappling with right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. If you found this breakdown valuable, please take a quick second to hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more highly structured, insightful explainers. See you in the next one.